So we, as animal and vegan advocates and environmental advocates, often talk about issues around food, around the meat industry, around animal agricultures, as moral issues, as environmental issues, as health issues. But the truth is, making food choices on the basis of health, on the basis of animal morality, on the basis of environmental concerns, is a privilege. To make those the basic questions that you're asking about your food is ultimately a luxury, and it is a luxury that is not afforded to many people. The vegan and animal rights movements at times have a real danger of veering towards self-righteousness, of feeling like we are morally superior to other people because of lifestyle choices that we have made. And we really need to question that kind of thinking in light of the fact that many of us who have chosen to make those choices have done so because we have the ability to make those choices. Food issues are justice issues and access issues. People make food decisions. Too loud? Okay, sorry. Food choices are made not only on the basis of morality, not only on the basis of health, not only on the basis of environmental concerns, but also on the basis of economic concerns, but also on the basis of geographic realities. And this is something that the meat industry and the dairy industry and the egg industries understand well. They understand the U.S. animal agriculture interests, that in the U.S., they have reached capacity with the consumers that they can hook on their toxic products, that successfully the factory farm economy of mass-produced animal products produced with enormous suffering, facilitated by government subsidies, has reached the level of consumption that they're going to reach. They're producing at this point more product than they can get people to eat. So now they need access to more consumers. And the way that they do that is by pursuing global markets, looking to countries that currently have lower rates of consumption of animal products, but a higher rate of increase than we do in the United States. Looking at emerging markets and doing what they can to increase access to those markets through free trade agreements. Free trade agreements could better be called in practice corporate power tools. These trade agreements really benefit just about more than anyone else animal agriculture interests. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade agreement negotiated during the Obama administration and ultimately never voted on as a direct result of activist organizing, was studied by the U.S. International Trade Commission, and it found that for pretty much every layer of the U.S. workforce that they studied, this trade agreement was going to be a loser, with one notable exception. Some segments of agriculture, and in particular, dairy, beef, pork, and chicken. So these trade agreements basically are deals for the meat industry, for the dairy industry, and they understand that. That's why if you go to the website of the National Pork Producers Council, they're not talking about being afraid of vegan potlucks. They're talking about passing trade agreements. If you go to the website of the Dairy Export Council, they're talking about NAFTA. If you go to the website of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, they're talking about wanting to pass a free trade agreement with Japan. They want lower tariffs, they want lower food safety rules, they want to eliminate animal welfare rules, they want what are called science-based standards, which is a euphemism for basically letting the corporations set the standards based on their bogus research rather than based on actually protecting consumers and taking reasonable precautions to protect people from dangerous foods. Europe recently conceded that they would accept acid-washed poultry from the U.S. Because Europe is moving in the direction of accepting more of our toxic products. Fortunately, there are limits because European consumers don't like that idea. For years, there's been a negotiation between the U.S. and Europe for a transatlantic trade and investment partnership. And this is the meat industry's big strategy to roll back all of the high standards that have put in place to protect European consumers, to limit the abuses of animal agriculture interests, and to say that European consumers don't want this kind of food. Well, our meat industry doesn't like that. They want the whole world eating toxic factory farm products to maximize their profit potential. But because of European resistance, that trade agreement is largely moving nowhere. So the meat industry now is looking at Brexit. Now that the UK is leaving the European Union, they see the opportunity for a new potential market to lower standards and get in more toxic, cheap food. Because ultimately, it's not that they like poisoning people per se, it's not that they like using toxic chemicals, it's not that they like torturing animals particularly, it's that all of these things lead to cheaper products, and cheaper products means more people buying. It means more food, more consumers, and more profit. It means producers adhering to higher standards being driven out of the marketplace, and it means more global domination for factory farm interests. So we as activists need to build on the victory that we won when we stopped the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and now need to stop the meat industry with its new trade agenda, with trying to increase dairy market access through a revised North American Free Trade Agreement, trying to stop a trade agreement with Japan, trying to stop a trade agreement with the UK. Also, when we talk about food access issues, we need to think domestically. We need to realize that in the United States, access to healthy food, access to less environmentally destructive food is a luxury. For many poor communities, and particularly communities of color, healthy food is not available. Vegan food is not available. In fact, when stores selling these products come into communities, this is often a hallmark of gentrification. Stores catering to white consumers, selling at high prices that are unavailable to local communities, and ultimately making those communities more attractive to people who will push out the previous residents. In this sense, veganism actually becomes an attack on marginalized communities, and this is something we can't stand for. As a movement, we have not done a good job of building important relationships to work for food access and to work for food and to work towards food justice. People of color attempting to work with the animal rights movement have been marginalized, have faced hostility, have not been listened to, have been tokenized. For many in the animal rights movement, the way that we talk about issues around race is to appropriate the experience of black slavery without the consent of black people in making comparisons between animal agriculture and slavery. For many in the animal rights movement, we feel entitled to appropriate the phrase Black Lives Matter into the bastardized and racist phrase All Lives Matter, and then apply that to animals. All Lives Matter is a racist phrase, and it is a phrase that no animal rights activist should ever use. People in the animal rights movement feel entitled to question the phrase Black Lives Matter and make comments like it should be Black Lives Matter too, even when vegans of color tell them that this is an inappropriate comment for white activists to be making. And unfortunately, people in our movement, instead of giving solidarity to activists of color and working towards a more inclusive and just movement so that we can address these issues, will often back racists in our own movement instead of supporting communities of color and working towards a more just movement. If the only time your animal rights organizing is interfacing with communities of color is to protest a black circus or to protest at a court because a child is on trial for a cruelty case, a child of color is on trial for a cruelty case, if you're a protester being counter-protested by the NAACP, you're doing something wrong and you're hurting animals. We as a movement need to recognize that no one is going to take us seriously as a justice movement when we use phrases like animals first and think that we can be a single issue movement that only cares about justice for animals. It makes us look like a club, frankly, of racist white hobbyists who think cows are cute. And it will never get us to the point of a movement that can provide food access for all to help create a vegan world for all. So what we can do, for starters, though, because we have a lot of work to do as a movement on these issues, is support activists of color already doing this work. We should support projects like the Food Empowerment Project. We should support Black Vegans Rock. We should support projects like PEP Foods and the Open the Cages Alliance that are people of color doing work within communities of color to fight these food access issues, to do food education work, to instead of preaching out and scorning people who don't have access to food, to healthy, affordable vegan food, actually making that food available. We should amplify these groups, we should fund them, we should help them be successful, and we should listen to them and tell them how they need our help, not tokenize people, use people, and ultimately exploit people of color in a white-run, white-dominated, and ultimately white supremacist agenda masquerading as animal rights. So let us remember that we are a justice-based movement. Work for food access for all. Remember that animal liberation only makes sense within a broader context of liberation for all. We're supposed to be a movement fighting for equality. You can't be for equality for animals when you don't even believe in equality fundamentally. And fighting for equality for animals, but not giving a damn about equality for human beings is frankly perverse. So I'll end there, but thank you. And finally a plug. Where's Wendy? Wendy? Okay, so if folks want to hear more about these issues, particularly the trade issues I was talking about, I'm going to be speaking this evening on a webinar called The Climate Cost of Free Trade, talking about animal agriculture, free trade, and the meat industry's agenda. Wendy in the black over there is passing out flyers, and she can give you the flyer. We also, at our table over there, have a card you can sign to members of Congress asking them to oppose anti-animal trade agreements. Thanks a lot, folks.